What if the person you trusted most, the one who vowed to love and cherish you, was secretly plotting your demise? What if the life you built together was nothing more than a gilded cage, and the love you shared, a meticulously crafted lie? Tonight, we delve into a story so chilling, so twisted, it will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, betrayal, and the darkness that can lurk behind a perfect smile. This is a tale of a wife, a husband, and a lover, a triangle of deception that ends in a crime so perfectly staged, it was almost the perfect murder. Before we unravel this web of lies, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single moment of the shocking conclusion. Now let's begin. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and blooming roses usually filled the morning air at 127 Willow Creek Lane. It was a symphony of domestic bliss, a carefully orchestrated performance conducted by Eleanor Vance. To the outside world, Eleanor and Julian Vance were the epitome of a perfect couple. They lived in a sprawling, sun-drenched home in a wealthy suburb, the kind of place where secrets were buried deeper than the meticulously manicured flowerbeds. Their life was a masterpiece of appearances, and Eleanor was its most devoted artist. Julian was a man carved from success. A high-powered attorney, he moved through the world with an air of unshakable confidence. His charm as potent as the expensive cologne he wore. He adored Eleanor, or so it seemed. He showered her with gifts: a diamond necklace for their anniversary, a vintage convertible for her birthday, a life of luxurious ease. He saw her as the beautiful, graceful ornament that completed his perfect picture. He didn't see the cracks forming beneath the glossy surface, the silent screams echoing in the vast, empty rooms of their perfect home. Eleanor played her part with an Oscar-worthy performance. She was the doting wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who had it all. She organized charity galas, her smile never faltering as she charmed city council members and philanthropists. She hosted lavish dinner parties where the wine flowed as freely as the stilted conversations. She was beautiful, elegant, and utterly soul-crushingly bored. The gilded cage, for all its shimmering allure, was still a cage. The first tremor in their carefully constructed world arrived in the form of a man named Liam. He was everything Julian was not. A struggling artist with paint-splattered hands and a fire in his eyes that mirrored the untamed passion Eleanor had long since suppressed. They met at a gallery opening, an event Eleanor had attended out of a sense of wifely duty. Julian was schmoozing with a potential client, leaving Eleanor to drift through the sterile white rooms, feeling as cold and lifeless as the abstract sculptures on display. Liam was standing before a canvas of chaotic, vibrant colors, a storm of emotions that resonated with the tempest brewing within Eleanor. He wasn't looking at the art. He was feeling it. He turned to her, his gaze intense, and for the first time in a decade, Eleanor felt truly seen. "It's loud, isn't it?" he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Loud. Eleanor had been about to offer some polite, meaningless compliment. "The silence," he clarified, a wry smile playing on his lips. The deafening silence of a life unlived. It was as if he had reached into her chest and pulled out the very words she had been choking on for years. That one sentence, that single moment of profound understanding, was the spark that ignited the affair. Their meetings were clandestine, stolen moments in his dusty, turpentine-scented studio. It was a world away from her pristine, orderly life. Here, amidst the chaos of unfinished canvases and scattered brushes, Eleanor felt alive. Liam didn't want the perfect hostess. He wanted the real, messy, passionate woman hidden beneath the designer clothes and polite smiles. He saw the fire she had so carefully banked, and he wasn't afraid to get burned. He would trace the lines of her face with his calloused fingers, as if memorizing a masterpiece. He would listen, truly listen, as she poured out the years of pent-up frustration, the loneliness that gnawed at her in the dead of night. With Liam, she wasn't an accessory. She was a muse, a collaborator, a woman of flesh and blood with desires and dreams of her own. The affair was a reckless, exhilarating act of rebellion against the suffocating perfection of her life. But with the ecstasy came the ever-present fear of discovery. Julian was a man who prized control above all else. His jealousy, though rarely seen, was a sleeping dragon she knew she shouldn't wake. The thought of him finding out of the scandal, the public humiliation, was terrifying. But the thought of giving up Liam, of returning to the silent, gilded cage, was even more unbearable. The idea, at first, was a fleeting, ugly whisper in the back of her mind. A dark, intrusive thought she would quickly push away. But it kept returning, stronger and more insistent with each passing day. The more she fell for Liam, the more Julian became an obstacle, a warden in her self-imposed prison. She started to notice things, small, seemingly insignificant details about her husband's life. His unwavering routine, the same 6 a.m. run every morning, the same 2 cups of black coffee, the same meticulous way he arranged his tie. His predictability, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a weakness, a vulnerability she could exploit. The plan began to take shape, not in a sudden, dramatic epiphany, but in a slow, insidious creep. It was a cancer that grew in the fertile soil of her desperation. She researched, her late-night internet searches a stark contrast to the home decor and charity websites she usually frequented. She learned about poisons that mimicked natural causes, about crime scene forensics, about the common mistakes murderers made. She became a student of death, her textbook the dark underbelly of the internet. She chose the weapon with a chilling pragmatism. A rare, difficult-to-trace poison derived from a plant she could easily acquire. It was a poison that would cause a massive, sudden heart attack, something not entirely out of the realm of possibility for a high-stress, workaholic lawyer like Julian. The day she decided to act was an ordinary Tuesday. Julian had been particularly dismissive that morning, barely looking up from his phone as she tried to tell him about a charity event she was planning. He had waved a hand in her direction, a gesture of casual indifference that felt like a slap in the face. It was the final, tiny crack that shattered the facade of their perfect life. That evening, she prepared his favorite meal, a rich, creamy risotto and a perfectly seared steak. She moved about the kitchen with a calm, almost serene, detachment. Every action was precise, deliberate. She uncorked a bottle of his favorite expensive red wine, a vintage he had been saving for a special occasion. Tonight, she thought with a bitter irony, was indeed a special occasion. She poured 2 glasses, and in the privacy of the pantry, with trembling hands, she emptied the contents of a small, unlabeled vial into Julian's glass. The colorless, odorless liquid dissolved instantly, leaving no trace of its deadly presence. Dinner was a quiet affair. Eleanor watched him, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest, as he savored the meal, as he praised her cooking, as he sipped his wine. He was oblivious, a lamb to the slaughter, and for a fleeting moment, a wave of nausea and guilt washed over her. She looked at his face, the face she had once loved, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the man she had married. This was the architect of her gilded cage. The guilt receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "To us," Julian said, raising his glass for a toast. "To another perfect year." "To us?" Eleanor echoed, her voice a soft, steady whisper as she clinked her glass against his. She watched him drain the last of the wine. Then, she waited. It didn't take long. He was in his study going over some case files when the first spasm hit him. A sharp, sudden pain in his chest that made him gasp. He clutched at his heart, a look of confusion and fear in his eyes. He stumbled to his feet, knocking over a stack of papers, and looked at her, his mouth opening as if to say something, but only a strangled gasp escaped. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her face a mask of carefully constructed concern. She didn't rush to his side. She didn't call for help. She just watched as the life drained from his eyes, as he collapsed onto the plush Persian rug, his body convulsing for a few agonizing seconds before falling still. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart. He was gone. The obstacle, the warden, was gone. She was free. But her work was not yet done. Now came the second act of her performance. staging the perfect crime scene. She had rehearsed this part in her mind 100 times. Every detail was meticulously planned. First, she put on a pair of latex gloves. She took his now empty wine glass from the study and her own from the dining room. She washed them thoroughly, drying them and placing them back in the cabinet. She took the bottle of wine and poured the remaining contents down the sink, then rinsed the bottle and placed it in the recycling bin outside. Next, she went to his home gym, a small, sterile room he used religiously every morning. She grabbed one of his workout towels, one he had used that morning during his run. She carefully wiped down the surface of the small table in the study where his wine glass had been, and the doorknob. She then draped the slightly damp towel over a workout bench, as if he had just finished a session. She looked at his body on the floor. His face was contorted in a silent scream. She knelt beside him, and with a detached, clinical precision, she closed his eyes. She checked his pockets, removing his wallet and phone. She placed his phone on the table next to his laptop, which was still open to a legal document. She put his wallet on the dresser in their bedroom, in its usual spot. Then came the most crucial part of her plan. She had read that a sudden, violent heart attack could cause a person to knock things over, to create a scene of disarray. His fall had already accomplished some of that, scattering papers across the floor. She added to the chaos, but only slightly. A toppled-over pen holder, a book knocked askew on the shelf. It had to look natural, not staged. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at the scene she had created. It was perfect. A man, a workaholic with a high-stress job, had come home, perhaps gone for a workout, had a glass of wine while catching up on some work, and his heart had simply given out. There was nothing to suggest foul play, nothing to point to the quiet, unassuming wife who was now a widow. She took off the gloves, tucking them into a small plastic bag. She would dispose of them later, somewhere far from here. She went to the bathroom and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had to be convincing in her grief. She had to become the grieving widow. She took a deep, shuddering breath and thought of everything she had lost. Not Julian, not their life together, but her own innocence, the woman she might have been if she had made different choices. She thought of the years of silent loneliness, of feeling like a ghost in her own life. And the tears, when they finally came, were genuine. They were tears of grief, but not for the man lying dead in the next room. They were for herself. With tears streaming down her face, she picked up her phone. Her hand trembled as she dialed the 3 numbers she had rehearsed in her mind over and over again. 911. Her voice, when she spoke, was a masterpiece of panicked, heartbroken hysteria. "My husband," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "I think my husband is dead." The performance had begun. The flashing red and blue lights painted chaotic, dancing shadows across the pristine white walls of 127 Willow Creek Lane. The house, once a sanctuary of quiet, ordered perfection, was now a whirlwind of uniformed officers, paramedics, and detectives. Eleanor sat on the plush sofa in the living room, a cashmere throw blanket draped over her shoulders by a kind-faced female officer. She was the very picture of a grieving widow. Pale, trembling, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. Each shuddering breath, each tear that traced a path down her cheek, was a carefully calibrated part of her performance. Detective Miles Corbin observed her from across the room. He was a man in his late 40s, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much of the city's darkness. He had a reputation for being methodical, for noticing the small details that others missed. He approached her slowly, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Vance, I'm Detective Corbin. I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you a few questions." Eleanor looked up at him, her gaze unfocused, as if she were looking right through him. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice a fragile whisper. "He was fine. We had dinner. He was working. And then, I found him." A fresh wave of sobs shook her body, and she buried her face in her hands. It was a convincing display of shock and grief. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Corbin asked, his tone patient. Eleanor took a shaky breath and began to recite the story she had rehearsed in her mind until it had become a second-rate movie script she knew by heart. She told him about their quiet dinner, about Julian going to his study to work, about her going upstairs to read. She said she had come down to get a glass of water and had found him on the floor. Did he complain of any pain? Dizziness? Anything at all? Corbin pressed. "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "He seemed perfectly fine. Maybe a little tired from work, but that was normal for Julian." She was careful to weave in plausible details, to paint a picture of a man who was a prime candidate for a sudden heart attack. "He worked so hard. I was always telling him to slow down, to take better care of himself." Corbin nodded, making a note in his small, worn notebook. "Was your husband on any medication? Did he have any known health issues?" "He had high blood pressure," Eleanor said, another carefully chosen truth to bolster her fiction. "His doctor had prescribed medication, but Julian, he was terrible at remembering to take it. He always thought he was invincible." The medical examiner's preliminary report seemed to confirm Eleanor's story. The cause of death appeared to be a massive coronary event. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds. The scene was consistent with a man collapsing from a heart attack. To the initial investigators, it was a tragic but straightforward case. The next few days were a blur of condolences, funeral arrangements, and the suffocating sympathy of friends and family. Eleanor played her part to perfection. She wore black, her face a mask of sorrow. She accepted hugs and words of comfort with a quiet, dignified grace. She was the tragic widow, an object of pity and admiration for her strength in the face of such a devastating loss. Liam had called her, his voice a mixture of concern and a barely concealed excitement. "I saw the news," he had said, his voice low and urgent. "Are you okay? Do they suspect anything?" "No," Eleanor had whispered into the phone, her hand cupped over her mouth as she sat in the cavernous, silent bedroom she had once shared with Julian. "They think it was a heart attack. It worked, Liam. It worked. I told you it would," he had said, a note of triumph in his voice. "We're free, Eleanor. We're finally free." But Eleanor knew it wasn't that simple. She had to maintain the charade at least for a while. She couldn't rush into a new life with Liam. It would raise suspicion. She had to mourn, to grieve, to be the woman everyone expected her to be. Detective Corbin, however, was not entirely convinced. It was a gut feeling, a nagging sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. Julian Vance was a man in his early 40s in seemingly good health, despite the high blood pressure. Sudden heart attacks happened, of course, but something about this one felt off. He decided to dig a little deeper. He started with Julian's life insurance policy. It was a substantial amount, with Eleanor as the sole beneficiary. Not unusual for a married couple, but a motive nonetheless. He then looked into their finances. The Vances were wealthy, but their spending was also extravagant. There were mortgages, car payments, credit card bills that suggested a lifestyle that was just on the edge of what they could comfortably afford. He interviewed Julian's colleagues at the law firm. They painted a picture of a brilliant, but ruthless, attorney. A man with many rivals and perhaps even a few enemies. But no one seemed to have a credible motive for murder. He also interviewed Eleanor's friends, the women from her charity circles and the country club. They all said the same thing. The Vances were the perfect couple, so devoted to each other. Eleanor was devastated, utterly lost without Julian. But one of the women, a gossipy socialite named Brenda, let slip a small, seemingly insignificant detail. "I always thought it was strange," Brenda said, sipping her tea, "that Eleanor never wanted to travel. Julian was always trying to get her to go on these exotic trips, but she always had an excuse. Said she was a homebody. But I don't know. It was like she was afraid to leave, afraid to be too far away from something. It was a small thing, but it stuck with Corbin. He decided to pull Eleanor's phone records. It was a long shot, but he wanted to see if there was anything out of the ordinary. The records showed the expected calls to friends, family, the funeral home. But there was one number that appeared frequently, at odd hours of the day and night. A number that wasn't listed under any of her known contacts. Corbin ran the number. It belonged to a Liam O'Connell, an artist living in a converted warehouse loft in the city's arts district. Not the kind of person he would expect the prim and proper Mrs. Vance to be associating with. He decided to pay Mr. O'Connell a visit. The loft was a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the Vance home. It was a chaotic, vibrant space, filled with the smell of oil paint and turpentine. Liam was working on a large, abstract canvas, his hands and clothes splattered with color. He was handsome in a rugged, unconventional way, and he radiated an intensity that was both captivating and unsettling. "Mr. O'Connell?" Corbin said, flashing his badge. "I'm Detective Corbin. I'm investigating the death of Julian Vance." Liam's expression didn't flicker. He put down his paintbrush and wiped his hands on a rag. "I heard about that," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Tragic. Did you know Mr. Vance?" Corbin asked. "No," Liam said a little too quickly. "I knew his wife, Eleanor. We're friends." "Friends," Corbin repeated, his gaze sweeping around the studio, taking in the intimate, personal space. "How did you and Mrs. Vance become friends?" "We met at a gallery a few months ago," Liam said, his story sounding well-rehearsed. "She has an interest in art." "An interest in art," Corbin echoed, his voice laced with a subtle skepticism. "Your number appears on her phone records quite frequently, Mr. O'Connell, at all hours of the day and night. That seems like more than just a casual friendship based on a shared interest in art." Liam's jaw tightened, but he held the detective's gaze. "We're close friends," he said, his voice firm. "She confides in me. She was unhappy in her marriage." It was the first crack in Eleanor's perfect facade. Corbin felt a jolt of adrenaline, the familiar thrill of a case beginning to break open. Meanwhile, Eleanor was becoming increasingly antsy. The waiting was agony. She wanted to be with Liam, to start their new life together, but she was trapped in the role of the grieving widow. She had to keep up appearances, to attend the endless stream of luncheons and gatherings in her honor, to listen to the same platitudes and expressions of sympathy over and over again. She had also started to notice things that made her uneasy. A car parked across the street from her house for a little too long. A hang-up call on her landline. Was it paranoia, or was she being watched? Her fears were confirmed when Detective Corbin called and asked her to come down to the station for some follow-up questions. His tone was different this time. The gentle, sympathetic detective was gone, replaced by a man with a hard, professional edge. Eleanor sat across from him in a small, sterile interrogation room. The air was thick with a palpable tension. "Mrs. Vance," Corbin began, his voice deceptively calm. "We've been looking into your husband's death, and a few things aren't adding up." Eleanor's heart began to pound against her ribs, but she kept her composure. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady. "The medical examiner's full toxicology report came back," Corbin said, his eyes fixed on her, watching for any flicker of a reaction. "They found something in your husband's system, a rare, plant-based poison, one that induces a massive heart attack and is very difficult to trace." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't possible. She had been so careful. She had researched a poison that was supposed to be undetectable. "A poison?" she said, her voice a breathy, incredulous whisper. "You think Julian was murdered?" "We know he was murdered, Mrs. Vance," Corbin said, his voice as cold and hard as steel. "And we found something else. We searched your internet history." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "You've been doing a lot of reading lately, Mrs. Vance, about rare poisons, about how to fake a heart attack, about how to beat a murder investigation." Eleanor's carefully constructed world began to crumble around her. The walls of the interrogation room seemed to be closing in. She could feel the perfect crime, the perfect alibi, the perfect future she had planned, all slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. And then there's Liam O'Connell, Corbin continued, his voice relentless. Your friend. We know about the affair, Mrs. Vance. We know you were unhappy in your marriage. We know you stood to inherit a great deal of money. It all paints a very clear picture. Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. She had to deny it. She had to stick to her story. But the evidence was piling up against her, an insurmountable mountain of her own lies and deceptions. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. The mask of the grieving widow was cracking, and the cold, calculating woman beneath was beginning to show through. Corbin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. It's over, Eleanor. We know you did it. The only question now is, are you going to take Liam O'Connell down with you? The mention of Liam's name was like a physical blow. She had done all of this for him, for them. The thought of him being dragged into this, of him facing prison, was unbearable. But at the same time, a sliver of resentment began to creep into her heart. He had encouraged her, had celebrated their freedom. Was he as culpable as she was? The detective's words hung in the air, a tempting offer and a veiled threat. The perfect crime had unraveled, and now, trapped in the harsh, unforgiving light of the interrogation room, Eleanor Vance had a choice to make. Would she confess and try to protect her lover, or would she drag him down into the abyss with her? The grieving widow was gone, and in her place was a cornered animal, ready to do whatever it took to survive. The second act was over, and the final, tragic curtain was about to rise. The silence in the interrogation room was a living entity, pressing in on Eleanor from all sides. Detective Corbin's words echoed in her mind. Are you going to take Liam O'Connell down with you? It was a masterful move, a psychological wedge driven between her and the very reason she had committed this monstrous act. For the first time since she began her meticulous planning, Eleanor felt a tremor of genuine, unadulterated panic. Her carefully constructed world wasn't just cracking. It was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Her mind, usually so sharp and calculating, was a maelstrom of fear and fury. Liam. This was all for Liam. For their future. The image of his paint-splattered hands, his intense gaze, the intoxicating chaos of his studio, it had all seemed so real, so worth any price. But now, sitting under the sterile fluorescent lights of the police station, that world felt like a distant, foolish dream. She thought of the poison, the one she had spent weeks researching. It was supposed to be her masterstroke, a ghost in the victim system, mimicking nature's cruel hand. How had they found it? The toxicology report. That was a variable she hadn't fully controlled. She had banked on the ME seeing a middle-aged, overworked lawyer and simply signing off on a heart attack. It was a fatal miscalculation. Her arrogance had been her undoing. And the internet history, a rookie mistake. In her confidence, in her belief that she was smarter than everyone else, she had used her own laptop. She had cleared the browser history, of course, but she was a woman who knew how to host a gala, not how to scrub a hard drive clean of its digital ghosts. I want a lawyer, she finally said, her voice hoarse. It was a weak, desperate move, a retreat from the battlefield where she had so confidently expected to be the victor. Corbin simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He had her. He knew it. The confession would come eventually. People like Eleanor Vance, those who lived their lives in a fortress of control and perfection, they didn't break. They imploded. While Eleanor was being processed and placed in a holding cell, Corbin and his team executed a search warrant on Liam O'Connell's loft. The artist was a different man from the cool, collected individual Corbin had first interviewed. When faced with a team of officers and a warrant, his bravado crumbled, revealing a core of fear and self-preservation. The loft, which had once seemed to Eleanor like a haven of passionate creativity, now looked like the squalid den of a desperate man. The officers found more than just canvases and paint. Tucked away in a dusty portfolio, they found sketches of Eleanor. Dozens of them. Some were tender, capturing a softness in her that the world rarely saw. But others were darker, more disturbing. There was one of her standing over a fallen, faceless man, a look of grim triumph on her face. It wasn't evidence of a crime, but it was a chilling glimpse into the twisted fantasy that had fueled their affair. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was found on Liam's phone. The police technicians retrieved a series of deleted text messages between him and Eleanor, messages that spoke of their problem, of the cage she was in, of a future where they could finally be free. One message from Liam was particularly damning. "Once the old man is out of the picture, we can be together. Just be smart. Leave nothing to chance." And Eleanor's reply, "Don't worry, I have it all planned. It will look like natural causes. No one will ever know." It was the nail in their collective coffin. The perfect crime, so meticulously planned by Eleanor, had been undone by the careless, digital whispers of her lover. When confronted with the sketches and the text messages, Liam's loyalty to Eleanor evaporated. He saw the life sentence looming before him, the end of his art, his freedom. He began to talk, to spin a story that painted him as a hapless victim, a man manipulated by a cold, calculating black widow. He told the detectives that Eleanor was obsessed with him, that she was desperate to leave her husband. He claimed the idea to murder Julian was entirely hers, that she had presented the plan to him, and he had been too afraid of her to protest. He admitted to encouraging her, but he insisted he never thought she would actually go through with it. It was a pathetic, self-serving performance, but it was enough to seal Eleanor's fate. He gave them everything. Details of their affair, the things Eleanor had told him about her unhappiness, her chillingly casual mentions of how much better life would be without Julian. Back in her holding cell, Eleanor had no knowledge of Liam's betrayal. She was clinging to a fragile hope that he would remain silent, that their love would be strong enough to withstand this. She was so lost in her delusion that when her lawyer finally arrived, a high-priced attorney her family had hired, she was still trying to formulate a plan, a way to spin the evidence, to create a new narrative. But her lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne who had seen it all, was blunt. "They have your internet history, Eleanor. They have the toxicology report. And they have Liam O'Connell, who is currently in the next room, singing like a canary to save his own skin." The news hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Liam, he had betrayed her. The man for whom she had sacrificed everything, the man for whom she had damned her own soul, had turned on her without a second thought. In that moment, all the love she had felt for him curdled into a thick, black hatred that was far more potent than any poison she could ever have concocted. The fight went out of her. The intricate web of lies she had so carefully woven had become her own shroud. There was no escape. Julian, her husband, the man she had dismissed as a boring, predictable obstacle, would have his revenge from beyond the grave. His predictability, his routine, was the baseline against which her own chaotic, desperate actions stood out in such stark relief. The trial was a media sensation. The story of the beautiful, wealthy socialite who murdered her husband for her lover was irresistible. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had hidden such a dark secret behind a perfect smile. Eleanor sat at the defendant's table, a pale, hollowed-out version of her former self. The designer clothes and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by a drab prison jumpsuit and the weary, defeated expression of a woman who had lost everything. She listened as the prosecution laid out its case, piece by damning piece. The internet searches, the toxicology report, the deleted text messages. The star witness, of course, was Liam. He took the stand and, with a convincing display of remorse, painted Eleanor as a manipulative monster. He twisted their shared moments, their intimate conversations, into a narrative of his own victimization. He was the innocent artist, seduced and corrupted by a bored, wealthy wife who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. Eleanor watched him, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. She saw him not as the passionate lover she had risked everything for, but as a weak, sniveling coward. And in that moment, she made a final, desperate decision. If she was going down, she would not go down alone. When it was her turn to testify, She fired her lawyer and chose to represent herself. It was a reckless, theatrical move that stunned the courtroom. She stood before the jury, not as a penitent sinner, but as a woman scorned. Her voice, once soft and melodic, was now laced with venom. She didn't deny the murder. Instead, she owned it. But she also exposed Liam for the coward he was. She read their love letters, their passionate, incriminating emails, aloud to the court. She described, in lurid detail, how he had encouraged her, how he had whispered in her ear about their future, how the murder plot had been a collaboration, a shared, twisted dream. "He calls me a monster," she said, her eyes locking onto Liam, who sat pale and sweating with the prosecution team. But this monster was created in his studio. It was fueled by his whispers, his promises. He wanted Julian's money, Julian's life, just as much as I did. The only difference is, I had the courage to act, while he only had the courage to hide behind his canvases and my back. Her testimony was a stunning, horrifying spectacle. It was a murder-suicide of character, a final, desperate act of a woman who had nothing left to lose. It didn't save her, but it did succeed in dragging Liam down with her. The jury found them both guilty. Eleanor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Liam, thanks to his initial cooperation, received a lesser sentence, but he would still spend decades behind bars. As Eleanor was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she caught one last glimpse of Liam. Their eyes met for a fleeting, terrible moment. There was no love, no passion, only a shared, bottomless abyss of hatred and regret. The gilded cage she had so desperately tried to escape had been replaced by a concrete one, a cell where she would spend the rest of her days, haunted by the ghost of the man she had killed and the memory of the man who had betrayed her. The perfect crime had ended in the most imperfect of ways. The performance was finally over, and all that was left was the stark, ugly reality of what she had done. The silence in her cell was louder, more profound, than the silence in her perfect home had ever been. It was the deafening silence of a life not just unlived, but utterly and completely destroyed.